In John chapter 10, it talks about how Jesus says, My sheep hear my voice and they know me. I know them, they know me, they obey me, they listen to my voice. So we are going to be missionaries. And so we're just trying to tell stories about what happened before we heard this call and how we started getting familiar with God's voice. So I shared how I thought God asked me to quit my job, and 2 weeks later, COVID happened. So, this is a story about how we bought our house. So, we moved to Colusa County in February. It was actually Valentine's Day of 2014. And we rented a house, and it was great. But of course, everyone wants to buy a house. We wanted to buy a house. So I don't know how long it was, maybe a year or two. We went and we looked for a lender and we tried to qualify for a loan. We didn't qualify for a loan because my husband and myself at that time, we both had student loans. And at the time, student loans counted against you. So he said, he was trying to give us advice, lower your debt. So, um, so we did that. A couple years later, we came back. We tried to get a loan. Still couldn't qualify for a loan. So again, a couple years later, we went back again, and we didn't qualify for a loan. And there was like always something a little bit different. And the crazy thing is that he always remembered us because of our situation. So after the third time, I was like, God, you can tell us when to buy a house. Like, if you want us to buy a house, we'll buy a house, and you tell us when to buy a house. So I just prayed that prayer, and I was just talking to God. And as I prayed that prayer, I felt impressed. Like, I felt like I heard this voice, this impression that said, when your landlord asks you to move out, that's when you'll buy a house. And I kind of just thought it was my own little voice. Um, but I was like, our landlord's never going to ask us to move out. Like, this is what he does, and we're good renters. Like, why would he ever ask us to move out? But I let it at that, trusting that God would tell us when to buy a house. So, 2020 came, and in June of 2020, our landlord asked us to move out. And it was a unique situation because of COVID and all this stuff. And he needed that house back. And when he asked us to move out, I was like, Teddy, I remembered that voice from I don't know how long ago. And I was just telling Teddy, I was so excited we were going to buy a house. Um, in the meantime, my mom had been diagnosed with cancer, and July 1st of 2020, my dad called and said, "Hey, you need to come over here because like your mom has days, maybe weeks to live." And so in the middle of attempting to pack up and look for a house, I went to Walla Walla, and she died a couple weeks later. And when I came back, I was like, okay, now we have to buy a house. And it was almost a blessing because my mind was so distracted from like what happened with my mom, because I was like in a frantic rush to try and find a house. And we look at houses, and at that time nothing was going for less than 250,000, and the market was crazy. Interest rates were low. Houses were going way over, what the asking price was. And so we were doing the best we can. We hardly had any down payment. I think we had like $5,000 to do a down payment. And um looking. So finally a lady I knew, she's like, "Hey, I saw this house in Meridian, and I saw it on Facebook." And so I contacted our realtor and I'm like, hey, can we check out this house? And it is a small house, but it was on the market for $180,000. So we came in and it needed some work. Definitely needed some work, which I wasn't afraid of. Like, that's what my family did. They bought houses, they fixed them up. And I knew it was a lot of work, but I guess I wasn't the one doing the work at that time. So I don't know if I really knew how much work it was. But, and so we said, no, we don't want that house. It smelled like marijuana. Um, and it was just like, there was something about it. We didn't want the house. And so the next day the realtor called us in and said, hey, are you sure you don't want to put an offer on that house? You're kind of in a bind. You got to be out of your house in like 60 days. I'd rather you get 2 yeses from 2 different houses than, nothing at all. So I said, okay, how much does she really want? Because clearly she wants more than 180. And so I'm tired of playing these games. How much does she want? Because I don't have time to play these games. So he's like, well, would you be willing to offer 185? And I was like, yeah, I'll offer her 185 and, be done with it. And so, it was Friday evening and like we observe the Sabbath. We don't do business on the Sabbath, on Saturday. And so I said, well, just call me on Sunday. And so he texts me on Saturday and he said, hey, I actually need your offer today because she has some other offers and she needs to know if she can decline them or whatever. So I need your offer today. And I was like, oh God, you be testing me. And I was like, okay, that's not the house for us then. So I told him, I said, listen, um, I never told him like we observed the Sabbath before. I was just kind of like, I'll talk to you on Sunday. And so I said, the best I can give you is my word that I'll offer you 180. I'll offer 185. Like that's the best I can do because we observe the Sabbath. And I tried to explain with him. I was like, hey, we understand if she can't do that. No big deal. Like we can let it go. And he's like, okay. And he texted back like later on that evening. He's like, hey, she declined all other offers and she'll wait for your offer tonight. I said, I can get it to you by sundown. Text me, email me the paperwork at sundown. I know that might sound silly, but yeah, those are just my convictions. So, anyways, so I got the paperwork after sundown and sent it to him. And to make a long story short, when the house was appraised, it was only appraised for 175. And I said, I'm really sorry, but we cannot do more than that. Like, we don't have an extra $10,000 just to give. Needless to say, we got the house for $175,000. Our interest rate is 2.3%. And everything, like from the septic inspection, I remember he was like, hey, I just want to let you know you're the only person who passed this week. And like it was just amazing how God was with us. And I will tell you, during this whole process, if you've ever bought in a house, it can be super stressful. And I knew that going into it. And every day I would just pray for peace. And I talked to people, and they would, like they're concerned for me. They're generally concerned. They're like, well, are you sure about that house? And blah, blah, blah. And just like kind of try and cast all these doubts my way when like that morning I was sure this is what was happening. And it's like you talk to people and, maybe they hadn't been in the ward that morning. And so they're leaning on their own understanding and just casting all these doubts. And I would just be like, oh, like so bummed out. And I would have to go back and spend time with God. And he would just reassure me, like, hey, don't worry about it. I've got your back. Like, don't let other people influence, what's going on. And so it was such an experience to stay connected with God, knowing what he's saying to you and not letting anyone cast doubts in your mind. And the crazy thing is I then realized, like, that's how Satan works. And he did it in the Garden of Eden with Eve. Like, did God really tell you to eat from the fruit, that you couldn't eat that fruit? And it's crazy. He works the same way. And he can use anyone. Like, he used a serpent in the Garden of Eden, but he can use anyone. He can use your closest friend, your spouse, family members, or just someone on the street. So, two things: don't let yourself be used by Satan. And the second thing is that when you hear those doubts, like, go back to God and know, like, somebody might be giving you wisdom, but you want to know, like, what God has for you, and what his plan is. So anyways, yeah, we just waited for God to tell us when to buy a house, and we were so thankful that he did. The other thing I prayed about, so our rent was like $1,000 a month when we were renting. They raised it like $50, 1,050, after several years. And something that I was like, God, is there any way you could get us a house and our mortgage could be less than our rent? But our rent was so low, and our mortgage is $910 a month. So I just was blown away. Those who wait upon the Lord will not be put to shame.